Well, welcome everybody. My name is Robin Eckersley. I'm the Head of Political Science at the University of Melbourne, and it is my great pleasure to chair this evening's event and to welcome Sunita Narain, who will be giving the Australia-India Institute oration tonight on reinventing growth without pollution. Can India find answers? Sunita Narain is an environmental leader with many, many talents, and she wears many, many hats. She's Director General of the Centre and Director of the Society for Environmental Communications and a publisher of the fortnightly magazine Down to Earth. She's a writer, she's an environmentalist, and she uses her knowledge for social change. In 2005, she was awarded the Padma Shri. I didn't know what that was, so I had to look it up. But is the fourth highest civilian award given by the Indian government. She received the World Water Prize for work on rainwater harvesting and for its policy influence in building paradigms for community-based waste management. In 2005, she chaired the Tiger Task Force at the direction of the Prime Minister, following the loss of tigers in Sariska. She's advocated solutions to build a coexistence agenda with local communities so that they get the benefits of conservation. And she was a member of the Prime Minister's Council for Climate Change, as well as the National Ganga River Basin Authority, which was also chaired by the Prime Minister. Now, she's worked a great deal in the space of climate change. In fact, her book that came out in 1991, Global Warming in an Unequal World, is one of the landmark publications for anyone interested in environmental justice in a North-South context. It was certainly a book I read and was very influenced by, and I think it's on the reading guides of lots and lots of subjects on environmental development around the world in all sorts of disciplines. The subtitle was that, A Case of Environmental Colonialism, which will give you some sense of the argument. And this, I think, gives a good indicator and marker of Sunita's interest in questions of equity in environment development, but particularly in relation to climate change. And she's worked in all sorts of ways to build awareness and consensus about the need for not just an effective, but an equitable international climate treaty, which is a big challenge, let's just put it that way. She's researched and authored lots of publications in this space, and in 2008-2009, she served as a member of the Swedish government's high-level commission on the need for adaptation and its links with development. So tonight, as I mentioned, her topic is Reinventing Growth Without Pollution. Can India find answers? Well, I can think of very few people who are likely to come up with answers other than Sunita Narain. So please welcome her to the podium.
Thank you, Robin. Do you want me to be here? Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you. It's wonderful to be back in Melbourne. I was here, I think, about 2 years ago and 3 years ago, and I see a lot of familiar faces. So wonderful. Thank you for coming. And thank you, Amitabh, for inviting me to the Australia-India Institute. Every Indian has their own version of the vision of India, and we have only 1 billion people, so so I will give you my version of this vision of India, and the question that I'm asking today, and the question I guess we are constantly confronted with in India, and that's really a question I guess many of us who work in the field of environment are confronted with it across the world, is can we reinvent growth without pollution? We need growth, especially in a country like India, but we definitely do not need it with the downside that it comes with, which is pollution and an extraordinary health burden, and now the challenge of climate change. So can we reinvent growth? And the question that I would ask also all of you is that, can India do it when Australia has not? And that's really the big issue that confronts us, because we're always being told that it's not possible. And I'm one of those people who believes it is possible, and we have reasons to believe that India can do it differently, and that's what I will try and speak to you. And this is at a time when I I do believe that the world has sort of reached the cross points where there would be very few people who would say that climate change is not happening, other than I think your Prime Minister. Okay, I think it's a minority now position, and I would certainly think that he belongs to it. But nevertheless, I think for many of us who've been involved with this for many, many years now, in 1990, when I was much, much younger and I went to the climate negotiations happening in Geneva. At that time, we talked about climate change, but it was all in the future. It was all about the possibilities, the maybes, then the whole sense of, yeah, scientists are talking about it, but is it real? Is it real for real? And will it actually happen? And this is now at a time when climate change science is much more certain. And when you think about it today, there is much more evidence that climate change is inevitable. Climate change, there's unanimity in opinion that it is beginning to happen, and that we are beginning to see the beginnings of it through extreme weather events that we are seeing all around the world. So science is more certain, but action has become even more uncertain. And that to me is always the strangest part of it. When I was in Geneva in 1990, we all believed that we would actually be able to combat climate change. And we all believed that we would live below, or definitely a 1 degree increase in temperature rise. Today, the 2 degree temperature rise is completely out of the window, and most of us know that it's never going to happen, that we will not have the 2 degree rise in temperatures, because policies are driving that change. And this is when we know that climate change, as it happens, will have huge impact on at least my part of the world, where I live. I mean, I keep saying this, and I will repeat it to you, that Mr. Chidambaram, who's our current finance minister, only occupies the chair. He's not India's finance minister. The monsoon is India's finance minister. And the fact is that if the monsoon becomes more variable, more extreme, it will have huge impacts on people and livelihoods. We are beginning to see today that you are seeing now this sort of extreme weather. We had hail in parts of Andhra Pradesh a week ago. We had people who died. We had crops destroyed. We're getting more of that freak, weird weather that is beginning to happen. And this is when I come from a country where it rains for only 100 hours in a year, 100 hours in a year. And so if that number of hours actually becomes smaller, which is what we are now beginning to understand, that moderate rainfall events will go down and extreme rainfall events will go up. So you will get more rain, there is no doubt, but that rain will come in smaller number of rainy days, which means that you will begin to see either an extraordinary challenge of being able to hold the water, to be able to conserve it, but at the same time, you're going to see impacts on livelihoods and life. And so climate change is real when it will happen, and it will have huge impacts on people, particularly the poor. Now, if that is the case, then why can we not step up our act? Why can't we get to the scale that is required and make the difference that we need to do in terms of cutting back on emissions? And that's really the global challenge. And the question that we need to ask, that we ask in India, in fact, is that can India get this right, even if the world has not? Can we reinvent growth without pollution? Can we change our trajectory of development so that we can give well-being to millions of people, energy to all, and yet not add to the emissions of greenhouse gases from coal burning, mobility to all, and yet not add to local or global emissions from oil? I mean, is that at all possible? And you have to remember the scale that I'm talking about. I mean, this is not small in terms of the needs of people. There are huge numbers of people who still do not have access to clean energy, do not even have access to energy. 700 million people cook still using firewood as their basic cooking energy need. And the fact is that we now understand that use of firewood, that biomass, is the cause of very high levels of health burden on very poor women in the world. So you have to make sure that you can reach energy to people. You still have 38% of India which uses kerosene for its lighting purposes. So even though the grid has reached, very large numbers of people are still in darkness. So the scale of energy needs in India is high, and it's a legitimate need. We need to make sure that very poor people in this world, that everybody has access to energy. It's an enabler. It's something that changes lives. And that we cannot say that today is the age of climate change and that, Australia will stop exporting coal to India because, we've done it all, but now they can't have their coal-based power stations because they're going to blow up the world if they do so. The fact is that's a legitimate question, and we will discuss that. But the need of countries like India to have large energy is critical, and the scale of it is huge. I want to leave that with you because even as we talk about every solution, we need to know that we need a transformation which meets the needs of very large numbers of people. And I do want to, if you compare it with what the world has done, it has technologies and it has methods of meeting the needs of small numbers of people, but using very large numbers of resources, very high amounts of resources. And that's what you need to compare when you keep India's needs in mind, that we have very large numbers of people whose needs have to be met, and the world has run out of space and it will run out of resources. And we are dealing with a world model which uses very large numbers of resources to meet the needs of very small numbers of people. Australia is 22 million people. That's a piddly little population. And it's 19 tons of CO2 emissions per capita per year. I mean, take Australia, take Europe, take the US. I mean, the fact is the world model is one in which it uses large materials, large resources, meets the needs of few. How do we reinvent this? That's the issue for us. Now, I'll give you one instance where I think, which gives me the answers of what's possible and how would we do it. My own city of Delhi. In Delhi in the mid-90s, we could not breathe. We found one day, we got up and we just could not breathe. The air was so foul that the air was black. Doctors gave us photographs of people they were operating on, and if they came from Delhi, even if they were non-smokers, their lungs were black as compared to people who were from out of Delhi. And there was a huge crisis of pollution. And we basically, the group I work with, we argued that Delhi could not take incremental steps to deal with its pollution. It needed to leapfrog, and we pushed for a different fuel itself. So we moved from petrol to gas, and we said move to gas, which is much cleaner in its emissions, and then you get a leapfrog, and you can move the entire city out of the pollution trap. And we did that, and we did manage to get clean air. We did reduce pollution in Delhi by taking that leapfrog option. But today we're losing that battle again. We're losing it again because the number of cars in Delhi have just exploded, imploded. And even if, as we have introduced better technology, we introduced cleaner fuel, we remain behind the problem. And this is not surprising because actually the whole world remains behind the problem, and we're just following the tracks, but many years behind. So if you look at it, if you look at vehicle technology, and just bear with me a little on this because it's a little involved as an explanation, as an argument. If you think about it, for most of us, when we grew up understanding the issue of pollution, the first thing we talked about was a pollutant called SPM. Most of us would not even remember it existed, suspended particulate matter. Okay? But that's what scientists measured, and that's what scientists said was bad. And that's what technology brought in to clean up. So you had vehicle technology that improved, you had fuel technology that improved, and you basically got rid of SPM from the air. And we all thought the problem's gone away because, we've now got cleaner technology. But as technology was introduced and we started looking at quality of air, science basically discovered that there was a new pollutant in the air, which is what they call PM10, and then slowly PM2.5, which is that the particulate matter had become smaller and smaller. That as technology improved, that the amount of particles had gone down, but the size had also decreased. And as the size had decreased, the same particles which would actually not go through our nose, because God made our nose with hair in it, which would keep the big particles out, and he didn't quite understand diesel at the time he was making our noses. The particle size got smaller, and that now science essentially understood that tiny particles were not just bad, they were killers, that there was enough evidence that PM2.5 actually added to mortality in the world, and it wasn't just about respiratory, but it was also cardiovascular problems that it added to. But as we then innovated further and invested further and brought in more money to reduce and to improve the quality of fuel, improve the vehicle technology, there's a new problem of NOx. Because as you increase the burning temperatures to reduce the particles, you increase the NOx levels. And as you increase NOx levels, you find you have another pollutant called ozone in the air, which is equally bad. So now technology has further innovated with new money, new investment coming in, and you now have a DeNOx catalyst on your vehicles. You have a catalytic converter to get rid of the PM10, you have a DeNOx catalyst to get rid of the NOx. And today, scientists are now saying that the next generation of pollutants is nanoparticles, which will actually go through your skin. So as technology has improved, you've remained behind the problem. And all this while, the sheer numbers of vehicles on our roads is actually adding to the climate change crisis, because transport is one major contributor to the crisis of climate change in the world. So the question that we have today is that what then are the answers for countries like India? Because if we stay on this path that you're on, that the rest of the world is on, then we will keep innovating, we will still remain behind the problem. And we also know that the answers actually are very different. I mean, most of us in the environmental field know that if you really want to deal with climate change and you want to deal with the issue of local air pollution along with global air pollution, then you need to reinvent mobility. Then the answer is not hybrid vehicles, and the answer is not biofuels. The answer is to do mobility differently. So to think about moving people and not vehicles. To think completely differently about the very paradigm of building your cities so that you could move people and not vehicles. And that would be doing it differently, thinking about it differently, and implementing it at a scale that we haven't seen before. And that's really the big issue, therefore, that we look at. I mean, the world knows today that it has to reinvent mobility, but it keeps doing looks for small answers to what has become today an existential problem, a very large problem. And the question then is, what can we do it differently? And I still believe we can. I mean, it sounds strange because I do come from Delhi, and if any one of you has visited Delhi recently, you'll know that Delhi is imploding with the sheer numbers of cars. We're adding to congestion, we're adding to pollution. We're constantly building more flyovers, and find as we build the flyovers, they just fill up, surprisingly, with cars, and road speeds go down. And we don't seem to be able to get ourselves out of the problem. And yet, and this is what gives me the optimism of thinking we could reinvent. And the reason is very simple, that Delhi, still today, only 15% of Delhi actually commutes by car. If you look at the latest figures in Melbourne, I understand it's about 75% of Melbourne commutes by car. And in Melbourne, you are reinventing mobility. And I have to say, and I was confessing this to Suzanne and others over my trip for the last 2 days, that the one thing I really envy you is your right to walk. Okay, I really envy that. Right to walk, right to cycle is the ultimate goal that any city can have. And I think when I walked around Melbourne, I definitely think that this is something that I will take back. And you are reinventing mobility. In the late 1990s, over 80%, as I understand, actually took a car, and now it's down to about 75%. 17% of Melbourne, as I understand, uses public transport. 1.6% use cycles. 3.5% walk. Now, that's very impressive. But not if you compare it to Delhi. If you compare it to Delhi, then you're actually not even beginning to be on the public transport revolution. Because 40% of Delhi takes a bus today. 40% of Delhi. And Delhi is India's second richest city. 40% of Delhi takes a bus. 10% of Delhi cycles. Only 1.6% of Melbourne cycles. 10% of Delhi cycles. Over 10% of Delhi actually walks to work because they're too poor to even cycle or take a bus. Okay? And as I said, only 13 to 15% of Delhi takes a car. So the question for us is that we use public transport today, and we do use public transport. 70% of India uses public transport today and non-motorized transport today. 70% of urban India across the cities of India. But we use public transport today because we are poor. And the big question is, can we and will we use public transport because and when we are rich? And that's the big transition that I believe that we have the opportunity to make. We don't have to do it the way that you've done it, that you first go the car route and then you fit in the bicycle lanes. We can actually build differently. We can do it differently. We could think about mobility very differently. But the problem is that there are no role models for us to emulate. And the question therefore becomes even trickier for me to say that we are going to do this. Because you know politicians all over the world. I mean, and I have some friend bureaucrats here, but I will still say it. And bureaucrats, they're very timid people. They do not like to do anything which somebody else has not tried in the world. They want to walk the route that somebody else has walked. And there are no role models to emulate. There is no city which competes with us today with our 70% of public transport because of poverty. Most cities which are even building today their public transport network are just beginning to squeeze in public transport into their car lanes. There's also the fact that there is huge corporate interest, or there will be no corporate interest, which is going to push for a bicycle and walk-led model. Not even a bus-led model, not even a tram-led model, not even a metro-led model. Corporate interests push for individual car-led models. There's also no economic thinking which drives this, because economic thinking across the world is that the more you consume, the better off you are. I mean, I will never forget, and most of you will never forget, that the 2 downturns the US has had when it's come to financial issues, both times their presidents have gone to supermarkets and bought stuff. Because it's always been the more you consume, the better off the economy is. And this time, the president even said, go buy a car. And when there was a downturn in Europe, the Germans ended up with giving a car scrappage program to say, scrap your old car, buy a new one, all in the name of environment, because that will give our automobile industry greater business. So at the end of the day, every corporate model pushes for cars. And economists teach us that the economic model of the world is the best model is the one that is consumption-led economic growth. So at the end of the day, when I'm looking at this, and I keep thinking to myself, often in Delhi when you think you're mad some days, and you're thinking about this, you think about it, all interests are converging around the fact that there will be a car-centric model. I mean, there's aspirations of people, there's corporate greed, there's economic thinking, and all that converges around this single issue of saying, you know, it's going to be a private transport-driven city. And yet, I still believe that we can do it. And the reason is that in Delhi, as I began with saying, only 15% of Delhi still drives. You need to find a city, an urban model in which 100% can drive. 26% of Delhi is already under roads. You can't get more roads, you cannot get more flyovers. Now, if at 15% you've saturated your roads in your cities, you clearly need to reinvent your mobility model to plan and provide for the rest. And that's the big opportunity we have. So you have an opportunity to actually think about how you could divide your road space based on equity of use. So if if people walk, 10% of Delhi walks, they get 10% of the road space. 10% of Delhi cycles, they get 10%. And if 40% of Delhi takes a bus, then they get 40% of the road space, and just the remaining is left for cars. So you replan and you reconceptualize thinking of the fact that you have to meet the needs of all. And if you could do that, and if you could actually push for those policies, if we can actually push for those policies, then you can reinvent mobility. Now, why would you push and how would you push for those policies? And that's what brings me to my other point that, you know, what you're really dealing with in countries like India is the issue of a difference between what I call very crudely, and you have to forgive me for this generalization, but the environmentalism of the poor versus the environmentalism of the rich. Think back on it. The environmental movement began in large parts of the Western world as a movement which was against to mitigate the waste generated because of wealth. And so you had a series of measures taken to deal with the waste that was generated. And that's the example I gave you also of the car, that you have the wealth, you have the technology, you have the money, and you invest in cleaning up even as you keep making the environment dirtier and dirtier. So in some senses, the environmental movement of the rich, and it's very much a movement also in India of the rich, I call it nothing more than garbage managers movement, because you're basically cleaning up garbage and you keep generating it and you clean it up as you go on. But the environmental movement of the poor is very different. The environmental movement of the poor comes from where India's environmental movement actually began. It comes from the fact that women of a village very high up in the Himalayas said that they will not let trees to be cut. Now, for most of us who live in cities, we believe trees should not be cut, so we thought it was a conservation movement. Here were environmentalists, illiterate women in the Himalayas saying, my tree will not be cut because it's a tree. But the women were never saying that. The women were saying that we should have the rights to cut the tree. So it was a political movement of self-determination. It was a movement to say that we should have the rights over our local environment. And if we get the rights over our local environment, we understand that those trees are important for our survival. We will not cut them. And if we cut them, we will grow them again. So it was actually a movement which was driven out of a very different ethic than the conservation ethic that we understand today as environmentalists. Now, and that's really, to my mind, that environmentalism, which is today very alive in India. If I think about India today, we have what I call 1 million pollution mutinies happening across the length and breadth of the country. There are people fighting against power projects, there are people fighting against mining, coal mining, iron ore mining, bauxite mining. There are people fighting against setting up a factory in grazing lands, takeover of agricultural lands. Now, if you were to put the sum of these movements together, these are really movements of very poor people. And the question that I often get asked is, why should the poor be against development? And it's a fact, they are very poor and they should be for development. But the fact is that what the poor of India are saying through those movements is that yes, we are poor, but modern development will only make us poorer, because mining, being extractive as it is, takes away minerals, destroys forests, destroys water, but doesn't replace it with livelihoods. Mining industry today requires very few people. It's not a job-centric industry. And so at the end of the day, people have livelihoods out of agriculture, they have livelihoods as graziers, they are fishermen. And that's the livelihood source that they're seeking to protect. And in some senses, they're also saying to us that they are therefore forcing us to ask for a different development model. But because the fact is, if India, and I think India will remain a democracy, and it will only become a stronger democracy. It is a very strong democracy today. And as it is a strong democracy, these voices will be heard. And as these voices get heard, we will not have access to all the minerals that we want, and all the coal that we want, and all the land that we want to build all the thermal power stations, which means that in some senses, it will force India to live within the constraints, the limits. And it will force us to innovate, to be ingenious with using less resources to do much more. So I see the environmentalism of the poor and the democracy that is pushing that environmentalism as a way to actually transform the development model, which forces us to live within our constraints and forces us to do a lot more with it. How am I doing with time? Want me to finish?
You've got another 10 minutes.
Another 10 minutes, good. Okay. So in some senses, what they're doing is to force us to share growth. And when I think about it, it does mean that we have to be very, very inventive. I mean, our forests are where our minerals are found. I mean, a map of India, if you look at it, it's a very fascinating map. And I've loved to always put that out to show just how you would superimpose it. If you take a map of India, the forests of India are like, I'm sorry, I'm going to draw this out for anyone who doesn't know India. You don't know what I'm doing, okay? But it's sort of the middle and the center is all the forests, and then you have them on the sides where the hills are on this side. This is the forests of India. Now, if you were to superimpose on it, where does the water of India come from? Exactly there. If you were to superimpose on it, where do the tigers of India live? It's exactly there. And then if you were to superimpose on it, where the minerals of India is, that's where they're found. But the worst is, if you were to put another layer on that map and say, where do the poor of India live? That's also where they live. Where is Naxalism found in India? That's also where it's found. So in some senses, what we have to find is a development model which is much more inclusive of the resources that we have there. And that's really, to me, that match of the forest, the minerals, the water, the poor. That's the question of the strategy for the future. How do you reinvent that strategy so that you would get the same mix in a way that you don't have poor people anymore, you still have sustainable forests, you may not get to all the minerals that you want, but you have the water that you want. What's that development strategy? And that's the whole sort of image of India that has to change in that map. The poor just have to go, and the forests have to stay. If you look at water, it's also very stressed, and the fact is we will never be able to use the water model that the Western world has. Today there are fights between water use and the allocation of water between the farmers and cities. And remember, in our part of the world, whatever anyone may say, we will still remain rural. 50% of India will still remain rural. It will still be dependent on agriculture as its economic activity. It will still need water. And yet we are urbanizing and we are industrializing, and urbanization and industrialization also requires water. So there's a huge issue of reallocation of water that is going to play out and is playing out today with violence. But the question that again exists is, and I don't like violence, but I do like conflict, okay? Because I do believe that conflict can lead to very inventive solutions. The fact is that as the farmers of many parts of India are saying, you will not get water other than over our dead bodies. for your city or your industry, it is forcing, and it will force, Indian industry to innovate. Today, large parts of Maharashtra are actually finding that it is better to take sewage for your power plant rather than water, because sewage is more reliable than water. Okay? And it's better for the power plant to invest in cleaning it up and reusing it. So you will force more water wisdom, more water prudency, more recycling that will happen because of this conflict. So it is not necessary that we have to sort of blow up. It's also a great opportunity for us not to do it the wrong way, not to build our cities which are water wasteful, which bring water long distances, waste water and bringing it, supply to people, don't get to all of them, not be able to take back the wastewater, not be able to treat it, and then destroy our rivers. So I think that, governments often get very, worried about limits and very worried about constraints. But I think this is the real opportunity for India to think about the possibilities of using the limits to maximize how can it actually build a different economy, an alternative way that will benefit large numbers of people. And that will be affordable and still use, sustainably use land and share the water. But this requires two things, and two more things, and just very quickly. One, it will require very innovative ideas and technologies for the future. The fact is that most technologies for sustainability have been built in the West, where there was money to have expensive technologies. We need a whole generation of technologies which are going to be affordable and yet sustainable. And that is going to require a huge amount of very inventive, out-of-the-box thinking, so that we can actually think about ways in which we can build this new generation of technologies which are affordable by very large numbers of people. And secondly, this itself will require us to think very differently. The issue of technologies will require us to look for answers in nature and to understand, in some senses, the art, the science, and the strength of nature. I mean, just think about it. And this is always an example that sort of gives me goosebumps when I think about this. Just think about it. It takes such a small temperature difference to carry as much as 40,000 billion tons of water from the oceans across thousands of miles and dump it as rainfall and the monsoons in South Asia. Such a small temperature difference. That's the force of nature. And yet we have actually used concentrated energy sources such as coal and oil that have created huge problems of climate change or local air pollution. And if you understood the ways of nature, you would actually move to weaker sources of energy. Two examples. One would be you would actually move towards rainwater harvesting. You would not concentrate the water in reservoirs first and then think of transporting it. You would think of using a weaker source of energy, which is using water where and when it falls. And secondly, you would think about solar, and you would think about decentralized grids, so that you would not just give one panel or another to people, but you would actually build the world's smartest grid fueled by millions of mini and micro solar plants. And that then becomes, in some senses, if you start internalizing this and if you think about the fact that I'm going to design policy using weaker sources and you're going to look at imitating nature, then you would think about doing it very differently also in terms of design of your energy systems. And there is a major challenge, because I am very clear that very poor people need large amounts of energy. And if you're talking about solar, it's still, and in spite of the fact that we have reduced rates of solar, it still remains an expensive source of energy. So the challenge then becomes, how do the poor in the world, who are so poor that they cannot even afford a kerosene lamp or coal, move towards a clean and yet more expensive source of energy? And that then brings you to that debate that Robin and I have been engaged in too many years and for possibly too long, which is why can't we get it right when it comes to climate change? Why can't we get global democracy to understand what is staring us in the face and build systems for international feed-in tariffs, build a climate regime which is based on equity, which is based on the rights to development and the rights of very poor people, push a carbon tax, raise the price here so that you would get the transition. And I think you don't get it, and we don't get it because we do not have global democracy. And the question that remains for me in India and for all of us in India is that India, therefore, if it remains a democracy, and it must remain a democracy, can reinvent. And the two preconditions are, one, we have to keep deepening democracy so that we have to listen to the voices of people. That will force us to look for alternatives. And two, and that's much more difficult, is that we have to have the courage to be different and to think differently. And that is the big challenge. Thank you very much.
We have approximately 15 minutes for questions. So the floor is open, but I'll just briefly say I used to think the climate crisis would be solved if we could get renewable energy cheaper than the price of coal in China. But tonight, Sunita, you've convinced me that if we can get cheap and affordable sustainable energy to the rural poor in India, then I think the problem is solved. And you've certainly got us a long way down that track in thinking how that might happen. So the floor's open for questions. Yes?
I think you have answered the question yourself at the end by saying that because there is no global democracy or even local democracies, that we will be stuck with this answer while the rich push a particular type of solution which suits them. So what should we do? Should we start a revolution?
I don't know if you can start a global revolution, but definitely I think in India, the challenge for us is to strengthen the many revolutions that are happening there. And I think, because we remain still a country which has to meet needs of very vast numbers of people, we have options of doing it differently. And I take strength from that. And obviously, I'm very angry with what's happening in the world. And I am very angry with what's happening in Australia, but I will not speak about it tonight.
It's a minute problem.
Yeah, please.
Sunita, it was really heartening to hear your vision and your strong optimism in the face of the multi-layered problem that is yet transformation in India. I'm interested to hear what your aspirations or your vision is for the participation of the Indian middle class, which is a force to reckon with. I'm talking about people my age, post-1990s, economic reforms, access to education, great jobs, know a lot, but there's a paradigm in terms of we do want to have affluence and we do want to kind of emulate the lifestyle of the West. What kind of role do you see for the middle class in this revolution?
It's a very good question, and something that troubles me a lot, I have to confess, because at some level, I see middle class rising in India as being a great thing, okay? Educated people, interested in the country, capable of looking for new answers. It cannot be bad. And yet, there are two things that worry me, and that's something that we need to find ways of dealing with it. One, middle class brings the middle class environmentalism to it, okay? When I compare the NIMBY of the middle class to the NIMBY of the poor, there's a big difference, okay? A NIMBY of the middle class is not the next, we have two NIMBYs happening right now in India, which are very interesting. In Delhi, there's a great NIMBY happening where the residents of a middle-class colony are saying, over our dead bodies, are you going to have this garbage dump next to us? They're building a sort of state-of-the-art incinerator next to a colony, Sukhdev Vihar. And so they've gone to court and there's everything. Now my question is, not there, but then where? And the fact is that we're not saying we won't have garbage. We're just saying we don't want the incinerator next to us. Now, there is another NIMBY that is happening on the very reverse side of it, which is happening in the city of Trivandrum, where the villagers outside Trivandrum are saying, you can't bring your garbage to us, okay? So villagers are telling the city of Trivandrum saying, you want to deal with your garbage, you deal with it in your backyard, not in our backyard. Okay? And that is forcing a huge change because Trivandrum now is finding that it has no place to dump its garbage. So it has to rethink its garbage disposal systems, and it has to think about how it can produce less garbage, how it can actually recycle, how it can do segregation, how it can do more composting. So it's changing the dynamics in Trivandrum because of that NIMBY. But the NIMBY in Delhi is basically only leading to the fact that people are saying, not in my backyard, but go and do it in somebody else's backyard. Now, that's where I think we have a major role to play with middle class, where we need to be able to get middle classes in India to understand that they can be different, that there is no need for them. And I think there is options because middle classes in India are still not disconnected from the rest of India. There's still the first generation, there's a lot of connection, there's a lot of understanding of the crisis of poverty in India. And so I think we need to keep talking about it and make those connections, because otherwise my fear is the middle classes of India will become, as it is becoming today, a group of people who wants benefits for themselves without thinking about what is the larger responsibility that they have for the country as a whole. And that's something that worries me, and I'm constantly also looking for answers. How do we deal with it? And I will try and keep looking for them.
Can I ask a really quick follow-up?
Very, very small, because there's other hands.
Yeah, I'm sorry, and I won't give such long answers also.
Social license created for the Aam Aadmi Party as a bigger phenomenon, revolution, which might well kind of shift the paradigm.
I would love to think so, but I'm not certain yet. I think that there's a lot of anger in India, which is rightfully there, because I think the nepotism, corruption, and the sheer incompetence. I think we're all very angry, and there's a voice, therefore, that they're using. I'm not sure if it'll lead to the kind of changes that I'm looking for, that you would look for, because free energy, free water is not the answer for India. Okay, the rich today get free water, the poor don't. So all Aam Aadmi Party has ended up doing is to subsidize the middle class, not the poor. And that's big issues that we need to deal with. Sorry.
Okay, we'll start at the front and then up.
Yes. I'm just wondering how important you see the democratic rights of women and the education of girls in particular as a catalyst for reinvention, not just in terms of population growth, but for environmental awareness generally.
I don't know about environmental awareness. I mean, I'm very clear that women are they're at the forefront of all family needs, okay? So they are the ones who collect the water, bring the firewood, and so they should be much more empathetic towards any environmental change that happens. But, you know, I don't worry about that. I think all poor people actually worry about the environment. But I think when it comes to women's education, it's really a fundamental right. And I don't need any other reason to cover it up for, okay? I think the fact is women's education is a right, women's empowerment is a right. The fact is without the two, India cannot survive, okay? So I think that's good enough reason. We don't need it to be a feminist, eco-feminist reason or a development reason or anything else. The women of India have the absolute right for education and empowerment. And I'm sure we'll get there.
Okay, up back in the corner.
Good evening, ma'am. My question is regarding the statement you made about the mobility.
Yeah.
I think what we're getting, from my point of view, is that internet is the best answer to mobility in terms of cars. So you're developing that in India, internet. So that internet makes it less to mobilize people. We stay in the building. But then the problem comes to building, because people have to sit in the building. And as you know, that building are the biggest energy guzzlers. And India, as of now, still has to see a lot of buildings be made. Just like 20-30% of the building made. So what steps are we doing in terms of policies that, you know, the buildings that are going to come ahead are not energy guzzlers?
Very good question. And I mean, again, it's a question about rethinking thinking what a green building is, okay? India is doing everything that you're doing, okay? We are not very far behind. We also have green certification. We have the buzz of green buildings. Every industrial association will tell you they have a green building. CII leads the revolution on green buildings. Every builder will demonstrate that their building is green. Wonderful. I mean, the very fact that we are beginning to internalize the fact that we need green buildings, nothing wrong with it. Very good. But today, the big question for us is, what are the indicators of what is a green building? Okay? Now, the indicators have been developed in this part of the world. Okay? So, they're not quite the right indicators for a country like India. So, for instance, we have, any one of you been to Gurgaon? Okay. So, some of you have seen this glitzy new suburb. It's not a suburb anymore. It's a huge city sitting next to Delhi. And it has glass buildings. And all the glass buildings are certified as green. The reason is the green certification allows you to have, today the energy efficiency code in India allows you to have a window to wall ratio which is 40%, okay? Which basically allows you to build a glass building. But then it says to be green, you need to triple insulate the glass and you need to have triple efficient air conditioners. Now that's stupid in a country like India, okay? The fact is we don't need glass. We have a climate in which you should be opening your windows. You should be redesigning your buildings, thinking about how you could actually get a green certificate so that you use less material, not more material. And I think that's really, as I said, mobility is one such example. I can get into many of these. That's what requires you to think about affordable housing. Because if your green certificate comes with a big tag, the Indian government has just launched a green building, which is the new Ministry of Environment building. It's wonderful, it's beautiful, but it's 4 times more expensive than a normal building. The question is, maybe that's a price we have to pay for sustainability, but maybe we can also do it differently. And that's really the big challenge that technologists have all over the world. Why can't we look at building materials differently? Why can't we look at insulation differently? Why can't we look at building designs differently? And that's my argument for that new green technology, affordable and sustainable. If it's not affordable, in my view, it's not sustainable.
I'm going to slip in a quick one myself and use my privilege as chair. Could you explain how you would answer the accusation you probably have often heard that India's population is going to outstrip China's fairly soon, well before mid-century, and it looks like it's going down a coal path and we can't afford that because we'll all go under. So what is your response to that standard comment? And secondly, why is India importing coal from Australia given that you have significant reserves? I think you've hinted at the answer to that, but you could tease that out a bit more.
The coal question always makes me believe I'm a two-headed hydra. Okay, very clear. As an Indian environmentalist, I would argue that we have no alternative but coal, even today. And I know that will shock a lot of you in this room and say, but why not? I mean, the fact is the world is going solar. Why can't you go solar? But give me the evidence of any country which has the kind of scale of needs that we have that has gone solar yet, that has gone to wind, renewable, and everything else. So at this moment, at this current moment, what India needs is energy to meet the needs of very large numbers of its people. And unfortunately, coal is still the cheapest source of that energy. This is in spite, and I say this with great responsibility, this is in spite of the fact that my organization has tested mercury and coal just about 6 months ago, found very high levels of mercury in the blood and the hair of people, and we are fighting and asking for mercury controls on coal, which will further increase the price of coal. But even with that done, and even with an environmental cess that we have on our coal today of 50 rupees a ton, even then coal is the cheapest source. Now, unless we can find, and that's really the big issue for us, unless we can find that huge other transformation that I hinted at, which is how can you actually build an energy future which is at the scale that is needed, where very vast numbers of poor people, rural people, get access to energy, which is clean energy. But it is more expensive energy, which then means that you need 2 things. One, you do need a global system which will actually pay for that transition, which pays through a global feed-in tariff or some other system, pays for the differential between that coal-based power and the renewable power that will come in to meet the needs of people. And secondly, you need to get rid of hypocrisy. I mean, you cannot tell me that India cannot go coal when Australia, Germany, US, and a lot of other countries are still addicted to coal. And you have not made the transition that you're preaching to the rest of the world. So I think it's important for us to get some of these things right and straight.
And you provide a good answer. Anthony.
As a political economist, I think I couldn't agree more with your diagnostics of the situation. But it is interesting to me, and it certainly is embedded in what you have described and analyzed, but you never mentioned the word capitalism, ever, in your entire presentation. What? The word capitalism.
Capitalism.
Because what you're really effectively describing, of course, is really the capitalist model of development. And of course, within that, then I think in some ways, you're finding out, okay, how to constrain it in some form or another. And it could be, yes, changing a certain model or lifestyle, if you will. But I just want to hear something of what...
I never use the word capitalism. I don't even know what it means. No, I think, Anthony, it's time we moved away from this because, you know, this whole, you know, I don't know what replaces capitalism, okay? And I think all of us here are equally confused, what does it get replaced with? So why bother to beat a straw man? I would rather talk about, I don't know if it's a decapitalist system that I'm talking about. I don't know if it's a Gandhian system that I'm talking about. I don't know what it is. But I don't know that I need a system which can measure well-being, which can provide well-being to very large numbers of people, doesn't add to inequity in my country, and is much more efficient and sustainable. Give me that in a capitalistic system, I will take capitalism. I know it's not an adequate answer, but I think it's time. I just find that the minute you get into the discourse of capitalist system versus something else, you get into a discourse which then puts ideologies on two sides and everybody fights on an ideological basis. I want to move away from it. I think we deserve to move away from it because that debate has not got us anywhere. Now, if an entrepreneur can provide cheap energy to very large numbers of people, what's wrong with entrepreneurs?
So, we've reached 7 o'clock, I'm afraid, and
I have a few more questions. I will be very precise. What I'll do is I'll write down the questions and be quick on it. I hate not answering questions. Is that okay, Amitabh? Please.
We'll take maybe
okay. I have those two. Yeah, there's two ladies at the back. Yeah, and then I had one or two. I'll take down your questions, so I'll be quick about it.
My question was, what do you think the role of nuclear power should be in India?
Sorry, role of nuclear power. Oh. Okay, another two-headed hydra question. Okay, yeah. What else? Next to you, was that nuclear as well? Okay.
Could I actually add to the question, if I may? Which is, I'm surprised that you didn't say that nuclear power is the solution. Why do you say coal is the solution?
Okay, add that to
Why
that question.
isn't nuclear power is cleaner?
No, it's much more expensive. Okay, I'll come to it. Yeah.
Just one question, because you have worked at international level. You were right about the comment that developed economies, they have more of a garbage management than actually doing something. What's your observation of other developing economies, especially China, about their policies?
Okay, China. Yes?
Should the solution be grassroots up, or should there be leadership and like a top-down or a bottom-up approach?
Okay. Last. Sorry.
What is the one thing that India can pick up from Australia easily, keeping in mind its vast population, to help environment and control pollution?
Good. So should I begin? Yes. Nuclear. I mean, listen, I'm fundamentally not against anything per se. I mean, other than Coca-Cola. Okay. I'm not against anything. So I'm not sort of against nuclear power. I just think when you look at the scale of what is needed, I just think nuclear power doesn't fit in. The reason is as follows, and that's really where coal scores over nuclear. One, it's much more expensive. It takes a lot of time to build. Two, the resources are in the hands of very few people, like Australia, which can turn off the tap anytime it wants and not sell. And four, it has huge problems of contamination and safety. And when you start adding those costs onto nuclear plants, the cost of power only goes up. The fight that we're having in India today is on the liability bill. The liability bill issue is about cost, because Westinghouse is today saying that it cannot meet the cost of power as we would like it if it also has to meet the liability provisions that has been set on it by the Indian government. Because if you have liability provisions, the cost go up. Now, if the costs go up because of safety, the cost will have to go up. And so nuclear, to my mind, is only one of those fantasies of very big men. But thankfully, it will not go very far for every obvious reason. And I don't even waste my time talking about it. I won't. I mean, coal is a reality, and I will talk about it. And there are challenges on how you will deal with coal in an increasingly warming world. And there are questions that we will have to deal with, but nuclear is not even in my equation. Okay, so as far as China is concerned, I'm sorry. I've never really understood China. I'd love to, but it's one of those, you know, it's the fact is, one, they speak in Chinese. I don't know. And I am very reluctant to believe anything that comes from China in English, because I know how confusing India is. And I know that the reality of India is really, when you live there, you know what the reality is. And anybody who interprets India for me, I'm always very reluctant to believe that interpretation. And the trouble is, I only read an interpreted China. I don't read a China which is real. And I would love to know more about it. I would, because I think India needs to understand that trajectory and see what can we learn from it. I mean, Beijing today cannot breathe. And Beijing has actually done a second, third generation reform. We've only done a one generation air pollution reform. Now, if a third generation you can't breathe, what are we up to? So I'd love to know more. And I think it's one of, I do feel frustrated about that. And especially the work I do on excreta. I do a lot of work on excreta, looking at sewage and water. And I'd love to know how China is dealing with its excreta challenges. We are failing completely. And the news I get is that they're miraculously dealing with it. And my understanding is they can't if they're anywhere close to us. So then I'd love to know more. Okay. So my other last two is grassroots, up, down, both. That's what I say. There are no absolute models now in the world. And I think that's where, you know, in relation to capitalism, I think you have to think about what your needs are and reinvent based on it. Okay? And if you keep certain societal principles in place, which are placed, you know, principles of equity and justice and other things that we all believe in, then you plan accordingly. And you plan, obviously you need people to participate in decision making. There is no question about it. But having decentralized systems doesn't mean that you will have very good policies which will get added up to. So you also need a framework of policies which emerge at the global level. I mean, today the United States, just to give you a slightly longer answer, and Australia, and that's where I will not talk, but Australia and the US have come together on this great grand plan, which is every country is going to come up with a bottom-up solution. You know about this. So every country is going to set its own target for how much emission is going to reduce, and then those targets will be put together on a table, and we'll have a lottery on it. Okay, that's the grand plan today, and they justify it saying it's a bottom-up, it's a country-led initiative. You decide how much you can do, and then we'll see whether it's adequate or not. I mean, is that the way the world needs to do climate change politics, or will you decide how responsible are you based on your contribution to the creation of the problem, and set a target for you to reduce? So, you know, this top-down, bottom-up needs to be handled very carefully, and we shouldn't get caught in the trap of this. Australia, very simple, the right to walk. I just want to take back your pavements. Not your cycle tracks yet. Your cycle tracks aren't up to the mark, but your pavements are beautiful.
That's a positive note.
Inspiring and comprehensive as always. Sunita, thank you very much for doing us this honor. You might say that the cycle tracks in Melbourne are not as good, but the cycle tracks in Delhi did Sunita great damage. 4 months ago, she was in a terrible accident, and we are deeply grateful that you have come here despite that horrible bicycle accident. But you are India's, I described you in one of our dispatches as India's conscience on environmental issues, but you're also, I think, the world's conscience on many of these important critical environmental issues. Again, I'm sorry that you've come for such a short time, but I do hope you come again.
I will.
And I'm delighted and honored that Robin Exley, who is really Melbourne University's most well thought of international relations professor, but also a great thinker on environmental issues, she agreed to chair this talk. Thank you very much, Robin. And thank you, all of you, our great events and communications team, Elise, Simone, Cog, who's been busy tweeting. I think we're live tweeting, which I realized only about 3 lectures ago, that you can live tweet oration. So your oration has been live tweeted.
Wonderful. I will retweet it.
Thank you, Simone and Elise and everyone else who made this evening so memorable. Thank you, all of you, to come here. There are new people in the audience who usually don't come for our lectures, so that's a tribute to Sunita. But I do hope you come and sign up for our other lectures, including one on a question which I think everyone is wondering: what is the BJP, were it to be the party that wins power in Delhi, what is its grand strategy? So one of the advisors of Narendra Modi and someone who's helping to draft the manifesto is coming to speak on what date is that? Tuesday. Tuesday. He's Kanchan Gupta, a former journalist, and now is part of the executive committee of the BJP. So anyone wondering what India will look like with Narendra Modi in power, please come and listen and interrogate and ask him questions on Tuesday. Thank you once again. Have a good evening.